The man known to history as Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born in the town of Hyde Park, New York on the 30th of January, 1882. His father, James Roosevelt, was a Harvard graduate and successful businessman who had interests and investments in various coal and transport companies and also had connections with the Democratic Party, serving as the minister's secretary at the American Embassy to Great Britain in the 1850s under the then ambassador and eventual 15th President of the United States, James Buchanan. Franklin's mother, Sarah Ann Delano, whose ancestors came to America on the Mayflower, had married James in 1880 and was a driven and intelligent woman whose father, Warren, had once operated an opium business in Hong Kong, where she lived for 3 years. And at one stage, Sarah also attended a girls' school in the German city of Dresden. In the modern world, Sarah would have undoubtedly had a successful career of her own, but she was forced by the social constraints of the time to be a homemaker, which perhaps inevitably caused her to place much of her hopes for the future in Franklin, as he was her only child with her husband James. Franklin himself was an active child, who also proved to be intelligent and gifted at almost anything he undertook, and he soon became adept in the sporting activities of his class, such as horse riding, shooting, tennis, golf, and polo. Instead of allowing the family servants to educate Franklin, as was the convention of the time, Sarah chose to educate her son during his early years, until he was eventually sent to Groton Boarding School in Massachusetts. The headmaster of this school, Endicott Peabody, would prove to be an important guiding influence on Franklin over the coming years, teaching him the importance of Christian charity, and would later go on to officiate at Roosevelt's wedding in 1905. In 1900, Franklin's father James Roosevelt died, which was a devastating blow for him, but despite this, his prospects then improved a year later, when his cousin Theodore Roosevelt was elected President of the United States, and his commanding and energetic leadership soon made him Franklin's new role model. It was around this time that Franklin enrolled at Harvard College in Cambridge, Massachusetts, at which he failed to shine academically, and stated later that he studied economics for 4 years and everything he had been taught was incorrect. Despite him not enjoying his time at Harvard, Franklin graduated regardless in 1903 with an A.B. in history, and then, after dropping out of law school in 1908, joined the Wall Street firm of Carter, Ledyard and Milburn, working in the company's Admiralty Law Division. In 1902, Franklin began to court his distant cousin Eleanor, whom he had known since childhood, and after spending several years reaffirming their ties by means of family meetings and correspondence, Franklin successfully proposed in 1904. Eleanor herself was the youngest daughter of Theodore Roosevelt's brother Elliot, whose branch of the Roosevelt family had split from Franklin's in the 17th century, in the shape of Nicholas Roosevelt, who was Franklin's 4th great-grandfather and Eleanor's 5th great-grandfather. The couple were then married on the 17th of March 1905, despite fierce opposition from Franklin's mother Sarah, who thought her son was too young to marry, and at the ceremony, Eleanor's uncle, President Theodore Roosevelt, gave her away, as her father Elliot had died in 1894. Both Franklin and Eleanor then moved to the Roosevelt family estate at Springwood in Hyde Park, at which Eleanor had to endure the difficulty of living next door to her mother-in-law, and the couple then went on to parent 6 children together, one of whom, Franklin Jr., died in infancy in 1909. Despite giving birth to 6 children, Eleanor found married life to be difficult in many respects, and at one point stated that she found intercourse to be an ordeal that had to be endured, and this lack of natural intimacy would later result in Franklin having numerous affairs, and Eleanor herself would also go on to form close and possibly intimate friendships with a number of women. Perhaps the most notorious of Franklin's affairs was with his wife's secretary, Lucy Mercer, which began in or around 1916, that Eleanor then discovered when she found letters between the two by accident, which nearly ended their marriage, and it was only after Franklin's mother stepped in and told him that if he divorced Eleanor, she would disinherit him, that their union was spared. Despite this tumult, both Franklin and Eleanor would remain married until his death in 1945, but perhaps as a consequence of his extramarital liaisons, it remained a union based on mutual respect or duty rather than love or passion. However, regardless, Eleanor made Franklin promise that he would never see Lucy again, which was an oath that he would struggle to keep. In 1910, Franklin joined the local Democratic Party, which was eager to recruit him due to his family's name, and after being accepted and nominated, Roosevelt campaigned for a seat on New York's State Assembly, and after leading an energetic campaign, in which he travelled around the local area by car, Franklin won to the surprise of many, despite the local area being predominantly Republican, and he then assumed his new responsibilities on the 1st of January, 1911. Roosevelt then quickly gained a reputation as something of a radical within the local Democratic Party, leading a group of so-called insurgents, who were opposed to Tammany Hall, which was a political organisation in the area that controlled nominations and dictated policy, and had a reputation for corruption or looking after the interests of the rich and not the working classes or poor. Because of this, Franklin soon became a popular figure with many New York Democrats, and he then, in the 1911 Democratic nominations, caused controversy within his family, when he backed Woodrow Wilson and not his cousin Theodore Roosevelt's campaign for the presidency of the United States. Theodore had left the Republicans after failing to secure the party's nomination to campaign during the forthcoming election, which caused divisions within the party, and he then ran as an independent candidate for a newly created and short-lived Progressive Party. Despite him failing to secure his cousin's backing, Theodore was not angered by Franklin's support of Woodrow Wilson, as he was after all a member of the Democratic Party, which he would have been forced to resign from in order to support him, and it could be said that this was, in hindsight, the correct decision, as Theodore's progressives fell into obscurity over the coming years. Franklin's decision to back Woodrow Wilson was then vindicated when he won the presidential election of 1912, becoming the first Democratic president since Grover Cleveland, who left office in 1889. This election victory was a landslide for the Democrats, who won nearly 42% of the popular vote, and Roosevelt was then rewarded for his support of Wilson by the new president appointing him to be Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1913, under Josephus Daniels. Shortly after this appointment, Franklin resigned from his seat on New York's State Assembly in order to concentrate on his career in Washington, D.C., as he was seen by many to have a promising future ahead of him due to his intelligence, work ethic, and family name. During their time in the department, both Roosevelt and Daniels oversaw the introduction of a new merit-based system of promotion within the United States Navy, as well as extending civilian control over various aspects of naval administration, in which Franklin oversaw relations between the government and the members of the Navy's civilian workforce. This position would give Franklin a great amount of experience in dealing with labour issues, as well as industrial disputes, and also in naval administration during wartime that would both prove to be invaluable to him during the later Great Depression, as well as the Second World War, and it was this period as Assistant Secretary that forged his affiliation and love for the American Navy that would endure for the rest of his days. In 1914, war broke out in Europe, and there was a strong consensus of opinion that the United States should begin to rearm in case it was forced to join the conflict, and as a result, President Wilson then gave the go-ahead for an expansion of the Navy that was accelerated after the sinking of various civilian vessels, including the RMS Lusitania in 1915. Because of this, the United States Navy was more than doubled in size by the end of World War I, that ended after America joined the Allies against the Central Powers of Germany and Austria, which greatly hastened their ultimate surrender in the Armistice of 1918, and after the conflict, the US Navy was scaled back to peacetime numbers. In the aftermath of the First World War, President Wilson attempted to ensure lasting peace throughout the globe by establishing the League of Nations, which was first proposed and included as part of the Treaty of Versailles that was signed on the 28th of June 1919, creating the first international convent designed primarily to maintain world peace. However, the creation of the League of Nations greatly weakened Wilson's position as president in the eyes of many Americans, particularly those of a Republican persuasion, who feared their country's sovereignty could potentially be superseded by an international governing body, and who were also opposed to any American involvement in the affairs of foreign nations. This opposition then continued to gain momentum, until finally the Republican-dominated Senate rejected the president's plans for America to join the League of Nations, and Wilson's position was then further undermined by him suffering a massive stroke on the 2nd of October 1919 that left him bedridden for weeks, and his administration, much like himself, paralysed. It is no exaggeration to say that Woodrow Wilson's policies, at least in regard to foreign affairs, provided a template for Franklin Roosevelt's own political ideas over the coming decades, as he would, after the Second World War, resurrect his mentor's plans for a League of Nations in the shape of the United Nations. As it was now becoming increasingly evident that President Wilson's tenure was coming to an end, Roosevelt and his allies reached out to Herbert Hoover about the possibility of him becoming the party's next candidate for the presidency in the 1920 presidential elections. Hoover had formerly been a member of President Wilson's administration, but had never been a member of either party in the lead-up to the election of 1920, but then calculating that the Democrats were unlikely to be victorious, declared himself as a Republican, but failed to secure the party's nomination for the presidency by losing to Warren G. Harding. This in turn scuppered Franklin's plans to run as vice president under Hoover, but after James M. Cox was nominated as the Democratic presidential candidate instead, he chose Roosevelt as his running mate, and despite both men embarking on a campaign across the country, they were defeated by a wide margin in the election by Warren G. Harding, who became the 29th President of the United States on the 4th of March, 1921. The return of the Republicans to power simultaneously heralded a return of America to isolationism, in which involvement in foreign affairs was kept to a minimum, until finally the sleeping giant that was the United States of America was awoken from its slumber by the rise of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan in the mid-1930s. Although this loss was a bitter pill to swallow, Roosevelt had gained valuable experience in campaigning on the national stage, and was now a major figure within the Democratic Party, and was also seen by many to be the great hope of the left wing within America going forward. However, Franklin's hopes and dreams would soon be dashed to near smithereens when he, in August 1921, began to experience terrifying symptoms of paralysis from the waist down, combined with bladder and bowel dysfunction. The diagnosis for these ailments was grim to say the least, as Franklin had contracted poliomyelitis, otherwise known as polio, which is an infectious disease caused by the polio virus that is often transferred from person to person by infected fecal matter entering the mouth, possibly via unwashed food or unclean water. There has since been speculation that Roosevelt's symptoms were more consistent with Guillain-Barré syndrome, which is caused by the immune system attacking the peripheral nervous system, which in short is the relay between the brain and the limbs. But whatever the cause of his illness, Franklin was now paralysed from the waist down and would never walk or even stand unaided again. This illness would have ended the lives of many men, let alone their careers. However, Roosevelt evidently possessed great reserves of strength and determination, as he then set about trying to lead as normal a life as possible to ultimately facilitate his return to mainstream politics. He did this by having the pedals of his car adapted so he could brake and accelerate by hand, and even had a pair of iron braces constructed to enable him to stand or walk with assistance, where he would use his waist to swivel each limb in turn, enabling him to move upright for short distances. Despite these innovations, Franklin would spend the majority of his waking hours sitting in one of his custom-built wheelchairs, meaning that he would often have to be carried up and down flights of stairs in buildings where no elevators were installed, and this soon prompted him to have a service lift adapted at his home in Hyde Park, which enabled him to travel between floors unaided. Over the coming years, Franklin would go to great lengths to ensure he was never publicly photographed in his wheelchair, and would, when he was giving speeches or appearing in public, often be seen to stand by using his steel leg braces, along with the literal support of an aide or one of his children. For the time being at least, Roosevelt's illness meant that he had to withdraw from frontline politics for a time during the 1920s, so he could come to terms with his disability both mentally and physically. But despite this retreat, he still maintained close connections with the top of the Democratic Party, for which he would eventually give presidential nomination speeches in 1924 and 1928. Although these speeches were outwardly a show of support for the Democratic nominees, they were in reality dress rehearsals for Franklin's own political resurrection, as he calculated that he could not hope to win any future Democratic nomination, let alone the presidency, without being seen to be able to stand, and during both addresses, he wowed the crowds whilst gripping the podium with all his strength in a desperate effort to remain upright. This effort to appear mobile was in large part due to Franklin's fear that his disability would be used against him by his Republican rivals, whom he thought would claim his inability to walk would also impair his ability to govern, and it is certainly remarkable that throughout his lifetime and his later presidency, the true nature of Roosevelt's disability would remain unknown to the vast majority of the American public, who thought him requiring assistance to walk was due to him being lame or arthritic. Despite Franklin's public support, the Democrats were defeated in the presidential elections by the Republicans in both 1924 and 1928, largely due to the fact that the economy was booming, and also because the party was divided on various issues such as prohibition, that banned the production and consumption of alcohol from 1920 to 1933. Indeed, Roosevelt himself, like many men of his class, enjoyed drinking expensive cocktails, which along with chain smoking would become his guilty pleasures. In the lead up to the 1928 election, Al Smith, who was the Democratic nominee for the presidency, was forced to step down as governor of New York, as he could not by law hold the position as well as the presidency, meaning that an election had to be held to appoint a new governor as a consequence. Smith, fearing a Republican landslide, then asked Roosevelt to run as the Democratic candidate for the governorship of New York, and after a hard-fought campaign, Franklin was eventually triumphant, winning by the slender margin of 1% of the vote, making him the head of government in America's most populous state and a frontrunner for the next Democratic presidential nomination in 1932. In contrast to this, the Democrats and Al Smith were crushed in the presidential election, losing heavily to Herbert Hoover, which effectively ended Smith's ambitions of claiming the top job, and he would later go on to become the president of Empire State Incorporated, which was the company responsible for the construction of the marvel of architecture and engineering that is the Empire State Building in Manhattan. Then, on Tuesday the 29th of October 1929, the Wall Street crash sent the world's economy into turmoil, causing share prices of the New York Stock Exchange to collapse. This crash was primarily caused by a huge amount of speculative public investment being made in the US stock market during the late 1920s, in which millions of Americans invested their life savings into the stock market in the hope of making a fortune by buying shares in what they hoped were up-and-coming companies and/or commodities. To cash in on this boom of investment, many people even took out loans in order to buy more stocks and shares, and when no further loans could be obtained, they then bought stocks on an IOU basis, in the hope that they would be able to pay at a later date, as and when they made a profit. Another factor was corruption and insider dealing, which was undertaken by men such as Joseph P. Kennedy, the father of President John F. Kennedy, who during the 1920s sought to buy worthless stocks en masse, which made them appear to be a good speculative investment to the untrained eye. This mass buying then inflated the price of these stocks and shares, which Kennedy and his like would then cash in on by selling them to inexperienced investors, such as the general public, who would in the end lose nearly all their money when the stock market crashed. Kennedy would later go on to make millions during the Great Depression itself, by buying up potentially valuable real estate and land at reduced prices, that he would then later sell when the market improved over the coming decades, which at least in part funded his family's rise to power in US politics. No one knows what actually triggered the massive selling of stocks that initiated the Wall Street crash, but historians and economists have since speculated that a combination of rumour, hearsay, and the spread of panic caused a chain reaction of mass selling that flooded the market and as a result caused stock prices to tumble and millions of dollars to be lost. It should also be noted that the Wall Street crash was not the direct cause of the following Great Depression, but it certainly did undermine the confidence of the American public in the country's financial institutions, particularly the banks, as well as the government and Federal Reserve. Indeed, Although many of America's smaller local banks were still solvent and soundly run, the larger banks had, during the market boom of the 1920s, invested their customers, investors, and depositors' money into the US stock market, meaning that when the crash came, the banks lost millions of dollars of their customers' money that they were unable to give back due to the lack of funds. This meant that the banks were soon forced to deny cash withdrawals to the American public, which caused a panic-driven chain reaction or bank run across America and then the wider world, as millions of people rushed to withdraw their non-existent savings. This lack of cash flow inevitably crippled consumer spending, as well as lending, meaning that there were mass shortages of capital within the American economy, and as a result, businesses laid off workers in their millions, or closed altogether, and as America was the largest economy on Earth, the contagion spread across the globe, as international loans were recalled in the desperate search for money and private investment was slashed. The recall of these international loans inevitably devastated the economies of countries around the world who were still struggling to recover from the devastation of the First World War, particularly nations such as Germany, Italy, and Japan, who then saw a rise in radical nationalistic political parties who would seize power over the coming decade and plunge mankind into another world war. This panic and lack of capital was then further compounded by President Herbert Hoover's administration itself, as it thought the crisis would be short-lived and therefore refused point-blank to stimulate the economy with quantitative easing, which involved the printing of money that would enable the banks to stay open and lending and investment to continue. The government then arguably made things worse by raising tariffs on international trade, which did nothing but damage businesses across America and around the world, as it only restricted international transactions as well as the flow of goods. The Wall Street crash and following Great Depression inevitably damaged Herbert Hoover's reputation, particularly concerning economic matters, and with the end of his term fast approaching, Franklin Roosevelt stepped up his plans to run for the Democratic nomination for the presidential election in 1932. To help secure his future candidacy, Roosevelt first sought re-election as governor of New York by enacting and advocating various reforms to alleviate the crisis, such as setting up an employment commission, endorsing unemployment insurance, and aid to farmers, as well as better pensions for the elderly. These policies clearly resonated with New York's population, as he then won the state election by a 14% margin over his Republican rival, which solidified his position as the frontrunner for the Democratic nomination for the presidency. During the following months, Roosevelt appointed his campaign team and ramped up his plans for the forthcoming Democratic National Convention of 1932, at which he clinched the party's nomination by defeating Al Smith, who came a distant second. Roosevelt then, along with his running mate for the vice presidency, John Nace Garner, launched his presidential campaign, in which he pledged his support for America's workers by promising better regulation of the economy, stock market, and banking system, along with the cutting of trade tariffs, financial help for farmers, and investment in public works, in order to end the Great Depression. Franklin then went on to defeat Herbert Hoover by a massive landslide in the 1932 presidential election, by winning 57% of the popular vote and crucially securing control of both houses of Congress, meaning that he was able to pass legislation with greater ease without Republican interference. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was then inaugurated as the 32nd President of the United States on the 4th of March, 1933, in which he gave one of the most famous speeches in American history, stating, "So, first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." This rallying cry was important, as the American economy had slumped to new lows in the final months of the Hoover administration, making the task that now faced Roosevelt enough to vex a genius, as 1/4 of the workforce was unemployed and a further 2 million people were on the streets and in a state of near starvation. On top of this, food prices had fallen by nearly 60%, meaning that many farmers were now facing ruin and tens of thousands of banks were refusing cash withdrawals, which meant the businesses could not pay their employees and families could not buy food or goods. During his tenure as state governor of New York, Roosevelt gave regular radio broadcasts direct into people's homes that he named his fireside chats, in which he would lay out his plans for governance or address issues, and after becoming president, Franklin then continued these broadcasts on a national scale, informing the population of what he planned to do to address the economic turmoil. Almost immediately upon assuming his role as president, Roosevelt sought to address the paralysis that was gripping the banking system when he, on the 9th of March 1933, passed the Emergency Banking Act that gave him power to control bank opening times and also enabled him to order the Federal Reserve to issue currency so that cash withdrawals could recommence. This action then had the desired effect, as 6 days later, on the 15th of March, the banks reopened, causing share prices to rise by 15% as a consequence, as public deposits and withdrawals resumed, which effectively ended the bank run. After this, Roosevelt then initiated his program of relief, recovery, and reform as part of his strategy for ending the Great Depression, which is known today as the New Deal. He started by setting up the Federal Emergency Relief Administration in May of 1933, that was established to provide assistance to state governments by means of loans as well as grants, so that they could relieve unemployment through public work programs. The president then later that year signed a repeal that brought an end to prohibition, largely in an effort to help stimulate the economy and increase tax revenue, along with the people's morale, and shortly after signing the repeal, Franklin stated that he thought this would be a good time for a beer. These reforms were also augmented by the setting up of the Public Works Administration that would come to spend nearly $7 billion over the next decade, which is a massive figure in today's money, by initiating infrastructure projects throughout the country from roads to railways to dams and schools. This glut of state investment was then further increased by the establishment of further agencies, including the Civilian Conservation Corporation, that got 250,000 young men back into work on more local, rural projects, as well as the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which helped industry with funding for railroads along with large infrastructure projects. On top of this, the Federal Trade Commission helped farmers and homeowners with mortgage relief, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act aimed to raise commodity prices by paying farmers to reduce their food production by leaving fields bare and cutting back on livestock. To ensure workers were better paid and fairly treated going forward, the president then brought in the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 that was enacted to regulate industry and ensure fair wages for workers, and also restricted production to keep prices at an even level. As well as all this, Roosevelt sought to cut federal spending by slashing military expenditure by over $700 million, by restricting servicemen's pensions, but after a campaign was instigated by veterans' lobby groups, Congress overruled him and paid out the pension benefits in cash regardless, which in the end gave the economy a further boost through consumer spending. Then, from 1935 to 1936, the Roosevelt administration enacted the second part of its plans for relief and reform that is known today as the Second New Deal, which by and large consisted of further public investment, but more importantly focused on economic reform across various sectors. These included the 1935 Social Security Act that ensured the federal government was from then on bound by law to give aid to the elderly, the unemployed, and the disabled, as well as children in need, which was augmented with a kind of base state healthcare provision to ensure the poor had a certain degree of medical care. There then came the Works Progress Administration, which was the largest public works program to date, that funded the building of parks, schools, bridges, and roads in nearly every community across the country, and between 1935 and 1943, the WPA employed nearly 9 million people, whose wages would then buy food and consumer goods, that in turn pumped money back into the economy, producing the knock-on effect of generating new jobs. Next came the National Labor Relations Act that prevented the exploitation of workers by giving them fair working conditions, as well as pay, and also ensured that the industrial disputes and strikes did not occur through civil discourse, between employers and employee unions. Although Roosevelt's New Deal did produce its desired effect in getting millions of Americans back into work, it was met with fierce resistance within certain quarters of the private sector, as well as the Republican establishment, who were opposed to any kind of state intervention in the economy, and there is still a fierce debate today as to whether the centralized power of the Roosevelt administration was in keeping with America's capitalist principles, and some even claim that his program of reforms and relief was socialist in its outlook. One of the most ardent critics of Roosevelt's policies during this period was his old political ally, Al Smith, who as a conservative Democrat was opposed to the president's interference in private industry, and during the lead up to the 1936 presidential election, Smith tried to portray Roosevelt as a communist in all but name, and even compared him to Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. But Smith's public criticism soon backfired in spectacular fashion, as Roosevelt's reforms had lifted millions of people out of poverty and meant that he now had the loyal support of the majority of the American public as well as the country's unions, who saw Al Smith and the business leaders opposed to the New Deal as the kind of people who had caused the economic upheaval in the first place. Seeking to capitalize on his overwhelming approval ratings, Roosevelt then sought re-election as president in 1936 and won an unprecedented victory by securing all but 2 states, which was the largest margin of victory since the uncontested presidential election of 1820. Roosevelt's second term was largely dominated by him struggling to overcome the resistance of the US Supreme Court that had blocked or halted several of his New Deal reforms, and he then sought to end its opposition by proposing a bill to replace aging Supreme Court justices with his own supporters, which was subsequently blocked by a cross-party coalition who feared that Roosevelt's bill would make both he and his successors too powerful. Indeed, one of the criticisms that could be leveled at Franklin Roosevelt is that he was too controlling of his administration, as he was notoriously devious and conniving in his dealings, and famously once said that he never let his right hand know what his left hand was doing. This control and secrecy even extended to his last vice president, Harry Truman, who was kept in the dark about many of Roosevelt's plans during World War II, including the United States nuclear weapons program. However, one of the few people Franklin was unable to control in his life was his wife Eleanor, who consistently lobbied him throughout his presidency on matters that were close to her heart, such as help for the poor, as well as civil and women's rights, that she promoted during public appearances and radio broadcasts, and even held nearly 350 press conferences during her husband's tenure. Eleanor would also spend much of her time travelling the country, after which she would report back to her husband on the progress of his New Deal, and it is fair to say that her activism certainly aided her husband, who after all could not travel easily, as she would, after returning from her visits, brief the president at length on the situation across the country and what action she felt were required. This inevitably caused a great deal of friction between Franklin and Eleanor during his presidency, although on the whole they came to form a formidable political partnership that earned them both the respect and admiration of millions of Americans. By the late 1930s, there were growing concerns at the rise of Adolf Hitler's Germany in Europe, which was seeking to expand its borders by annexing neighbouring countries such as Austria and Czechoslovakia, that along with the aggressive expansion of the Japanese Empire in Manchuria, modern-day China, was starting to threaten world peace. The United States foreign policy had since the end of the First World War been isolationist in its outlook, because many people within the country did not want to interfere in any costly European wars, which was further complicated by large portions of the US population being descendants of European immigrants from countries like Germany and Italy. Roosevelt, who was a believer in Woodrow Wilson's outward-looking policies, was not an isolationist himself, but as his hands were largely tied by Congress and public opinion, he was prevented from interfering in the Spanish Civil War and the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in the late 1930s. This outlook then began to change, however, when Hitler broke his Munich Agreement with Britain and France that had allowed Germany to occupy the Sudetenland of Czechoslovakia in 1938 by invading the rest of the country the following year on the 15th of March 1939. This prompted Roosevelt to begin preparations for a possible war with the Axis powers over the coming months, as he recognised that America could no longer afford to maintain its isolationist stance, particularly as Japan was evidently bent on expansion of its own in the South Pacific, which could in time potentially threaten the United States colonies in the region, such as the Philippines. Then when Hitler invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany, which prompted Roosevelt to align himself with the Western Allies. And then when France itself fell to Germany in the summer of 1940, isolationism in the United States went into a steep decline, which garnered enough support to allow the president to sanction a massive increase in military spending, along with the country's first peacetime draft that would swell the ranks of the US Army to nearly 1.5 million men by 1941. Roosevelt also proved to be pragmatic in his choice of military advisors at this time, as he appointed Republican interventionists such as Henry Stimson and Frank Knox as his Secretaries of War and the Navy respectively, both of whom were in favour of his support of Britain after the fall of France, and as both men were not Democrats, their promotions helped win over many Republicans to the president's side. The president then increased his support of Britain and its new Prime Minister Winston Churchill, with whom he had been in regular correspondence with since the 1930s, by giving the Royal Navy 50 World War I destroyers in return for access to naval bases across the Caribbean, which proved to be invaluable in strengthening ties between the two nations, as well as the United Kingdom's naval defences. Roosevelt had before this sought to help the European allies by passing the Neutrality Act in November of 1939, that allowed the sale of US weapons in return for cash. However, this aid to Britain, Free France, China, and later the Soviet Union would be escalated into the $50 billion program of aid that is known today as Lend-Lease, which was passed into law in March of 1941, that allowed war materials and resources to be lent or leased to allied nations, under the pretext that doing so would aid US national security. Although it was traditional for US presidents to only serve 2 tenures in office, as the 2-term period was not yet enshrined within the US Constitution, because the United States was clearly entering into another period of crisis, Roosevelt then decided to campaign for re-election, that resulted in him winning an unprecedented 3rd term on November 5th, 1940, in which he won nearly 55% of the popular vote and 38 of the then 48 states. Although the head of the Japanese state was its Emperor Hirohito, the country's government had since the devastation of the Great Depression, much like Germany, come under the control of militaristic nationalists, who advocated the rejection of democracy, along with Western liberal culture, and sought to end Japan's dependence on foreign imports of raw materials, by means of the creation of an Asian Pacific empire. The first stage of this expansion took place in 1931, with Japan's invasion of Manchuria, which was then followed 6 years later by its annexation of China in 1937, that prompted the United States and Roosevelt to halt all exports of material from America that could aid the Japanese war effort, which included nearly 95% of Japan's oil supply. This essentially forced the Japanese to choose between halting their expansion or escalating it, the former of which was not an option. Therefore, plans were put into place for further invasions and attacks on territories and islands across South Asia, as well as the Western Pacific, including British imperial outposts, along with US colonies in the Philippines. The Japanese now saw the nullification and subjugation of both Britain's Eastern Empire and America's Pacific colonies and naval bases as key to securing their supremacy over the region, and it was also decided that the United States Pacific Fleet based in Hawaii would have to be destroyed, in order to ensure Navy supremacy in the Far East, and plans were then drawn up in the late 1930s to bring this about. The likelihood of war was then increased by the appointment of Hideki Tojo as Prime Minister of Japan on the 17th of October 1941, who had long advocated a preemptive strike against the United States, and over the following months preparations were finalized with the Emperor's approval by the Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Navy, Isoroku Yamamoto, for a massive naval task force to attack the US naval base at Pearl Harbor, along with simultaneous invasions of British and American colonies and overseas stations in the Western Pacific. In the meantime, negotiations were attempted with the aim of preventing hostilities, but when the Americans demanded a full Japanese withdrawal from China, in return for the re-establishment of trade, the decision was taken by the Japanese to initiate war with the United States. On the 26th of November 1941, a massive task force set sail from the Japanese home islands under the command of Admiral Choichi Nagumo and headed east across the northern Pacific, before turning south towards the Hawaiian archipelago. This fleet consisted of 6 aircraft carriers: the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shukaku, and Zukaku, which carried over 400 aircraft and were escorted by 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and 23 submarines. The Japanese then continued to approach Hawaii, and finally attacked the islands on the morning of the 7th of December 1941, resulting in over a dozen US ships being sunk or badly damaged, including 8 battleships and over 2,000 servicemen and civilians being killed or injured. However, the prime targets of the Japanese, the aircraft carriers USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, were out of port at the time of the attack, which was of vital importance, as these carriers would later form the nucleus of the United States Pacific Fleet that would come to decimate the Japanese Navy over the coming months and years. One day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt declared war on Imperial Japan, and the same day delivered a speech to a joint session of the US Congress stating that, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date that will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." 3 days later, on the 11th of December 1941, Germany and Italy joined with their Japanese allies and declared war on the United States. That in effect sealed their doom, as the world's richest and most powerful industrial nation had now joined the conflict, with whom the Axis powers could not hope to compete. This overwhelming might did not take long to manifest itself, as little more than 6 months after Pearl Harbor, in June of 1942, the United States Navy, along with the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise, engaged and defeated the Japanese Navy at the Battle of Midway in the South Pacific, in which all 4 of the Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, meaning that the country's offensive capability in the Pacific theater was effectively ended in one fell swoop. The Japanese were from this point onwards forced onto the defensive across the Pacific, and the Americans then started their operations against the European Axis powers, when they landed in North Africa in late 1942, culminating in over 300,000 Axis troops surrendering in Tunisia 6 months later, which came only a few months after Hitler had lost a further 500,000 troops in the Battle of Stalingrad on the Eastern Front. The main reason for these Allied victories were not simply their advantages in sheer manpower, but also lay in the colossal industrial capability the United States possessed, as between 1941 and the end of the war in 1945, the Americans produced nearly 2.5 million trucks, 90,000 tanks, and in 1944 alone produced more aircraft than Britain, Germany, Japan, and the Soviet Union combined. This industrial might, combined with plentiful natural resources, were the key to the American and Allied victory during World War II, as both Germany and Japan's natural resources were pitiful in comparison, and their industrial capacity was a mere fraction of the United States alone. Although Roosevelt decided that the war against Hitler's Germany was to be given priority over Japan, the Americans were still able, after the Battle of Midway, to steadily retake all of the Japanese conquests in the South Pacific in a succession of hard-fought amphibious assaults over the coming years, until by 1945, Japan was cut off, surrounded, and starving. In the lead-up to the opening of the Second Front in Europe, President Roosevelt had advocated that any Allied invasion should take place via northern France, whereas Winston Churchill in contrast argued that any invasion should be conducted through the Italian peninsula, stating that the country was Hitler's soft underbelly. However, the Italian theatre in reality turned out to be Hitler's tough old gut, as the country's hilly terrain naturally favoured the defensive. Therefore, the Americans' assertion that the major Allied invasion should be conducted through France can in hindsight be said to have been the correct course of action, as it resulted in a relatively speedy advance through Normandy after the D-Day landings, ensuring that Western Europe was not overrun by the Soviets after Germany's collapse. Despite Roosevelt's disability, it soon became evident during late 1942 that a conference was needed between the leaders of the Allied powers in order to better coordinate the war, and as the Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin refused to travel far from Moscow, the decision was taken for both Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt to meet in the Iranian capital of Tehran in late November of 1943. This involved Roosevelt having to travel over 7,000 miles from America to the Middle East, which took a massive toll on his health, and at the conference he sought to appease the Soviet Premier by distancing himself from Winston Churchill over the future of Eastern Europe, as he did not want Stalin to think that the Americans and the British were acting as a unified force. This involved Roosevelt refusing to partake in discussions regarding the post-war status of Poland, as he felt there were more pressing concerns, and seeing as the Soviets were bound to occupy the country over the coming months, Roosevelt calculated that it was more important to appease the Soviet Premier rather than alienate him. This cordial approach towards the Soviet Premier is illustrated by Roosevelt's response to Stalin's demand that 50,000 German officers should be shot after the war, to which the president jokingly replied that maybe 49,000 would be enough. That was met with outrage and disbelief from the British Prime Minister. In the end, Churchill's approach towards Stalin would prove to be correct, as Eastern Europe was subjected to nearly half a century of Soviet occupation after World War II. Therefore, it would perhaps be argued that Roosevelt's cordial attitude towards the Soviet Union was misguided. However, the Tehran Conference and the 14,000-mile round trip that it entailed had a devastating effect on Roosevelt's health, as he had been under massive stress for over a decade by this time, which was in no doubt down to the fact that during his presidency, America had been in an almost constant state of crisis. A chain smoker, Roosevelt had enjoyed a daily diet of fine food and cocktails for many years, but as he was unable to undertake regular exercise, it soon became apparent that his lifestyle and workload was taking its toll, which would later be further exasperated by him embarking on an even longer journey to meet with Stalin and Churchill in the Crimean city of Yalta in February of 1945. As a result of his visible deterioration, Roosevelt then underwent tests at Bethesda Hospital, Maryland in March of 1944, and was found to the great alarm of his attending doctor to have incredibly high blood pressure that at one point hit 240 over 130, and was also found to be suffering from coronary artery disease and heart failure, effectively meaning his time was short. To avert imminent disaster, Roosevelt undertook a period of rest and recuperation over the coming months, in which he cut down his smoking to a dozen cigarettes a day, as well as a single cocktail in the evenings after meals, and during this period spent some weeks fishing with friends, and after returning to the White House, only worked for 4 hours per day. Another source of comfort for Franklin during this time was the rekindling of his relationship with his former flame, Lucy Mercer, who had married after the breakup of her affair with Franklin nearly 20 years before, but was now widowed, and their reunion was instigated by Roosevelt's daughter Anna, who organised for them to see one another again behind her mother's back. This was perhaps because Eleanor and Franklin were not close as husband and wife by this stage, as they acted more like close friends or political allies rather than a couple. Therefore, Anna sought to alleviate her father's stress, as well as his loneliness, by helping him to see Lucy once again. However, later after his death, Eleanor discovered that Franklin had been seeing Lucy with her daughter's help, resulting in them not speaking to one another for some time. It was evident by late 1944 that the Americans were going to be victorious on all fronts in World War II, and despite being advised not to by those close to him due to his ill health, Roosevelt decided to campaign for a 4th term as president in November of 1944, from which he emerged victorious once again, by claiming over 53% of the popular vote and winning 36 of the 48 states, making him by far the longest-serving president in American history. In early 1939, top scientists such as Albert Einstein had written to Roosevelt warning him of Germany's possible nuclear weapons program, and shortly afterwards, the United States initiated the Manhattan Project with the help of many German Jewish scientists that had fled the country during the 1930s. This program eventually bore fruit on the 16th of July, 1945, when the first nuclear weapon, codenamed Trinity, was successfully detonated in New Mexico, and 3 weeks later the United States dropped 2 further atom bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on the 6th and 9th of August, 1945, prompting Emperor Hirohito to announce his country's surrender on the 15th of August. This weapon more than anything made the United States the world's most powerful country after 1945, and until the Soviets developed their own nuclear weapons in 1949, the country was practically invulnerable as a nation, as it now had, along with the atom bomb, the largest navy, air force, and economy the world had ever seen. One of Franklin Roosevelt's lasting legacies was his resurrection of the League of Nations in the shape of the United Nations, the formation of which had first been agreed between the President and Winston Churchill as early as 1941, and was finally brought into being in San Francisco on the 25th of April, 1945, at which the UN Charter was drafted, which bound all the participating nations to certain standards of human rights, as well as the preservation of peace for future generations. Over the coming years, Eleanor Roosevelt would also play a key role in the founding of the United Nations, when she was invited by her husband's successor, President Harry Truman, to become a delegate to the General Assembly after 1945, in which she chaired the committee that came to pass the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, and would continue to take an active role in politics and humanitarian issues until her own death in 1962. The United Nations was, in many ways, the zenith of President Roosevelt's political career, in which he had brought America out of the Depression, overseen its victory in World War II, and in the United Nations formed an international body whose aim was to prevent a reoccurrence of the massive bloodshed and suffering that had plagued mankind in the first half of the 20th century. However, Roosevelt would never live to see the world he did so much to form, as on the 12th of April 1945, while sitting having his portrait painted at his retreat the Little White House in Warm Springs, Georgia, the president complained of a terrific headache and soon afterwards lost consciousness and slumped forward in his chair. He was then rushed to his bedroom, at which he was diagnosed as having suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage, and a few hours later at 3:35 p.m, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt died, aged just 63. It is no exaggeration to say that many Americans were left in despair at the president's passing, as to millions of people he was a savior that had not only delivered the country from the greatest recession of the 20th century, but had also crushed Imperial Japan, as well as Nazi Germany in the largest and most destructive war the world had yet seen. A day after his passing, the president's coffin, draped in the Star-Spangled Banner, was taken to Washington, D.C. and progressed through the streets of the capital, lined with thousands of mourners, before being taken by train to his birthplace at Hyde Park, where he was laid to rest in the rose garden of his Springwood estate, where he, along with his wife Eleanor, remains to this very day. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is today considered by many American historians to be one of, if not the greatest president in the history of the United States of America. Although he certainly enjoyed a privileged upbringing in his early years of life, there is no doubt that he possessed immense reserves of strength and bravery to overcome the paralyzing disease that is polio, and for him to then go on to become president, let alone one of the greatest presidents in US history, is nothing short of extraordinary, and stands as a testament to his strength of character, as well as his intelligence and ability. Many critics of Roosevelt's New Deal have since his death claimed that his programs of relief and reform were far too liberal or even socialist in their outlook, as they increased the size and power of the federal US state, which in some people's eyes is at odds with the founding principles of the US Constitution. His defenders would argue, however, that his reforms were simply necessary measures in a time of crisis that lifted millions out of unemployment as well as abject poverty, and set the United States firmly on a course for a period of prosperity and wealth that was hitherto unparalleled in human history. What virtually all people can agree on, however, is that Franklin Roosevelt successfully guided America through the greatest war in human history, from which it emerged as the world's most powerful country. Therefore, it is difficult to argue against the assertion that America was stronger as a nation both internally and externally after his presidency than it was before it. What is also certain is that Franklin Delano Roosevelt is one of the most important figures in the entire 20th century, as his presidency shaped the geopolitical landscape of the entire world for decades after his death, and in many ways his life and career form the world we all of us live in today. What do you think of Franklin Roosevelt? Was his New Deal a socialist program that increased the power of the American state, or was he a hero who, despite not being able to stand himself, lifted the American people from their knees and set the United States on a course to greatness? Let us know in the comments section, and until next time, thank you very much for watching.